Good evening and welcome to the opening of Lumiere 2020, Possible Futures. My name is Greg Davies. I'm the chair of the Lumiere Arts Festival Association and also the curator of the CBU Art Gallery here in Cape Breton. It gives me great pleasure to open tonight with a discussion with our guest, Josephine Clarke, down here coming to you live from the Port Hawkesbury Civic Center. And I just would like to begin the conversation tonight by first of all making an acknowledgement that the Lumiere Arts Festival Association acknowledges that we are on the unceded ancestral lands of the Mi'kmaq people. And it is a great honor to be able to conduct this conversation and this festival over the next 2 weeks from September 12th through 26th on these lands. I'd also like to just acknowledge our thanks to the many sponsors for Lumiere over the many years that we've been in operation. In fact, this year marks the 10th anniversary of the founding of the Lumiere Arts Festival Association. Our sponsors over the years have been extremely important to us, and in this particular time this year of economic hardship, we understand that it is very difficult for some of our past supporters to assist, but we would like to acknowledge them nonetheless for all of the help that they have provided in the past, and for those sponsors and partners this year who have helped to make the event happen, we extend our deepest thanks. So I would like to begin tonight with our first guest, Josephine Clarke. We are down here in Port Hawkesbury. Josephine currently has an exhibition which is at the J. Franklin Wright Gallery here in the Civic Center. And we're going to get right into the discussion straight off the top. Josephine, welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
And I have several questions that I'd like to lead off the discussion with. We should be able to do this for about half an hour. But I think hopefully we can have an interesting discussion out of these few basic questions. The first one I really wanted to ask you was just about the show itself. Mm-hmm. If you can talk a little bit about the idea behind the exhibition, your work in it, and the title of the exhibition.
Okay. So I have a collection of 15 textile prints that I have made with rusty, abandoned items that I found traveling around Cape Breton. And these pieces really question our relationship with our past and how it carries forward into the future. I was really inspired by the remnants of past Cape Bretoners and their lives that I saw as I traveled to rural beaches and things like that around Cape Breton. And it really embodies like the point we're at in history, this point of flux and this point of shared duty and shared obligation. Yeah.
And the title of the show?
The title is What is Left Behind.
Right.
Yes.
And so there's an interesting sort of provocation in that question. Mm-hmm. It's asking what is left behind and what does that mean? Is that correct?
Yeah. For me, when I thought about the title of this exhibition, it really was a summation of this type of frustrated curiosity I felt when I saw these pieces, and it's kind of a call to the masses. Okay. When you interact with rural anonymous land, that it's not a park, it's not private land, it's just out there. And so you see that this land simultaneously belongs to everyone and to no one.
Right.
So what is stewardship in that situation?
Yep.
Yes.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
All right, that's very interesting. So one of the things that I wanted to sort of get into with this discussion is really the issue of process. Mm-hmm. Having looked at the work, I've had a chance to see it, and we actually have some work with us right here. Yeah. The process of making these works seems to be a very important part of the meaning of the work. And so I wonder if you can perhaps walk us through a little bit of how you actually make the prints that you're doing, and what the process itself means to you.
Okay. So I traveled to a number of back roads and lesser known spots off the highway around Cape Breton. And I've developed methods in which I know where to find abandoned things. And there are pieces that I have to assess, like, can I take them back to my studio and add value to them and things like that. And there are pieces that I actually produce outdoors. These pieces to me have special meaning because it's as if the ocean is communicating back to us what has been forgotten, that which we would rather forget.
Right.
Right? So it's like taking these pieces that would otherwise just exist in obscurity and putting them back into a space of attention to really come to terms with the impact of those pieces. So to me, at some point, these pieces ended up out in the land by someone's choice. Whether they intended to or not, those choices have impact. And so it's showing us that our relationship with our present, our past, and our future don't necessarily exist in isolation. Right? Like these choices have a ripple effect. So when I find these pieces that, through the choice of some other anonymous person, have ended up here, it's like I now have to pick up the torch, right?
Okay.
Right?
Yep.
So,
Yep.
yeah.
Right. So I'm just thinking with the process, especially with the prints, because what we have here are physical three-dimensional objects. They're really quite sculptural. But the fabric also is, well, it's three-dimensional, but we treat it almost as a two-dimensional kind of thing. Can you talk a little bit about how you actually make the prints and how you actually, the sort of relationship between the objects and the fabric itself that you're working with?
So it varies. It really varies based on like what type of metal the item was made out of, where it is, the texture, the weight of it. So the pieces you see up here are all stitched, stitched resist. So I stitch it to the actual texture of the item for this one. This one was stitched and then formed around, like molded around.
Okay.
But really, I try and play with the existing shape of whatever I have. Most commonly I'll stitch them, but sometimes they're weighted down. Sometimes like they're weighted down with rocks, stuff like that. Or sometimes I'll actually use like plant materials to adhere the cloth to the metal object. So I'll use like tree tannins or bean proteins, things like that, to bond it to the metal object. But it is a slow process. That's the component that can sometimes be the hardest to explain, is that sometimes it's just time, right? Like, so you need moisture, you need a catalyst of some sort, like some sort of acid or mineral like salt. So my pieces that I make in studio, I replicate that process in studio with an acidic agent. But the pieces I make outdoors, I use the natural conditions of what is already there in the land.
Okay.
So ocean water already has your catalyst and the salt that's there.
Right.
Yeah, and periodic exposure to oxygen through the wind and things like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you see a kind of mirroring between yourself and nature in terms of these objects? The objects that are abandoned or left behind are shaped by nature, shaped by the forces of nature. So they oxidize or rust, and they eventually decay if they're. And in a sense, as an artist, you're taking that process and treating it in your own way as well, because you're adhering the fabric to the metal or what have you, and and there's a transference of oxidized material or rust, and in a way your artwork is sort of, your process is sort of mimicking nature.
Yeah.
Is that important to you?
I think it is, because this is never an art form that you can expect accuracy. There's a certain degree of control you have to surrender. There's a certain acceptance of change, right? And patience, right? And I think there is rebellion in that, and that's why I value what nature does, and I'm inspired by what nature does, because we live, in this late stage capitalist world where we want more, better, faster now, and there is some kind of subversion in saying, no, let's see what happens, let's see what the piece wants to do.
That's very interesting. So I mean, there is a very subversive aspect to the work that you're doing in the process, which I think is very interesting. I'm going to actually move to a second question leading up on the issue of process, or developing it a bit further. And that is just to ask you a little bit about your childhood upbringing and your own past experience. As I understand it, you grew up in a rural community, is that correct?
Yeah. So I was actually born in McBride, BC. Small community of about 500 people. So that was where I spent like my early childhood. And, I think that instilled values into me that still inform my work to this day. because I was surrounded by people who sewed, or like my dad made fishing flies, or my mother gardened, you know, my other grandmother knit,
So a
people
lot of
hunted,
working
and
with
very,
the
very
hands.
tactile with
Yeah.
your hands. And you know, that was commonplace in my childhood, but as I got older, I started to have a new appreciation for that, because it kind of taught me that, you know, art doesn't have to sit up on a wall and exist to confuse you. Like, there is valuable creativity in things that are functional and things that are useful, right?
Yeah, and that's very interesting, because it's actually leading to a point that we have been discussing before we went live. We'll come back to that in a few minutes, about the relationship between craft and fine art, and the sort of implications of seeing a division there, which we'll come back to in a second, because I think there are a few things you'd like to say about that, which are connected with the process as well that you're talking about. Just in terms of the experiences, youthful experiences with those sort of tactile processes, clearly they're reflected in the work that you do. And I think you were hinting in some of your comments also at sort of the division of labor and the way our society is structured in this late period of capitalism.
Yeah.
That's obviously something of value to you, to sort of recall that experience from youth and play it into the work here.
Yeah. I mean, firstly, I would say that, like, in how we consume items in our lives, it's always produced somewhere else by someone else. So we've lost some aspect of our culture where we know where the things we consume come from, right? Like, gone are the times when everyone had their clothes made by the local dressmaker or things like that. So there is that very, like, geographic division of labor between the West and, like, the global South. That is something we are, I would hope, at the peak of. But again, as we were talking before we went on camera, there is a history in the world of craft and the world of art in how we subdivide labor as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, as we're looking to the future, and the curatorial theme for this year's Lumiere is possible futures, which to me, it would actually, the decision to have that as a curatorial theme came before the pandemic actually hit, but it seems to have, it seems to be an ideal theme for us to look at now, because the future is so very uncertain. But I'm wondering now, because there's so much discussion also around neoliberalism and sort of late capitalism and the impacts that is having upon the lives of so many people in a very negative way, because your work is also reflecting upon traditions that go back long before the idea of manufacturing in far off places. That's obviously informing some of the critical statement that's underneath your work. I'm wondering if, being here in Cape Breton, which is very different from a kind of urban environment, if that in turn also, because you've been here for a few years now, if that is also having an impact on the way that you're reflecting upon your own work and developing some of these themes.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, like, so I grew up in interior BC, and I got my education in coastal BC in Vancouver. And you're sold this idea of, like, yes, you go to the urban place to get your education, and that is where the jobs are. And then, you know, upon graduation, I realized that, like, do I have the tools to exist in an urban environment? And then I come out here, and it's like all the values that were instilled in me growing up rurally as a child suddenly came to have more poignant meaning. Like, my work is tied to the land, for sure.
Yeah.
And I feel like where we're at, like you said, at a point of global uncertainty, I think that rural areas are kind of left out of the conversation a bit. So, you know, I think that ties back to how I've entitled this work, and the concepts behind it is, like, where is our place in this as well?
Yeah.
So it's kind of like asking for our seat at the table.
Yeah,
right?
Yeah, perhaps. But I think it's also interesting that you're saying these things as somebody who, as a student, as an art student, was looking towards urban environments to sort of grow your career. And you've come here by circumstance, but you're kind of rediscovering the importance of those rural values. As we look to the future, I think it's interesting to look at places like Cape Breton as well and what they have to offer that urban environments may not offer artists. There's room to breathe and grow here. And it's no secret that Cape Breton for some time has been an attraction for artists who did flourish in urban environments but came here to do their work in their studios. Richard Serra and Robert Frank and so forth. June Leaf is another. So there's a particular value to the experience of making art in a place like this that I think is important.
I think just, it's a hard concept to explain what like headspace is. Like coming to Cape Breton, you can just be, you're not competing, right? So there's something quite valuable in that.
Yeah. And I agree, it's difficult to put your finger on it and kind of explain it, but I know exactly what you mean by that. Okay, well, we're going to move on to the question of art and craft and the relationship, relationship, because I think there's a lot in that. I just want to talk a little bit about your experience with the Cape Breton Center for Craft and Design, because you've been doing a residency with the center for some time now. Maybe if you could talk a little bit about that experience, the impact it's had on your work and your development as an artist, and then we'll get on to that last meaty question about the relationship between craft and fine art.
So I'm currently an artist in residence through a project run by the Cape Breton Center for Craft and Design at the Customs House Artisan Incubator. I've been there just over 2 years, coming up on 2.5 years, and what it was a chance for emerging craft professionals to take their craft and hone it into a viable business. And it's a unique space because I work there with 2 other artisans, and we have the shop and everything. But really what it gave me was like a chance to immediately engage with a creative community. And that was something I hadn't seen before. Making art was something I always wanted to do, and I just didn't think that I could or didn't know how. And seeing that there is a community here that is willing to rally around that and values that and wants that to happen has been a really unique experience.
Right. Yeah. No, that's great to hear. So now we move on to the question about art and craft, which we had discussed a little bit before this went to air, but it's a loaded kind of question, I think, in many ways. But looking at your work, certainly I can see how people would read it as craft, but it's very easy also to look at it as fine art. Personally, for me, the division between craft and fine art is a very thorny kind of thing, and I think in our conversation before, you feel that way also, I believe, yourself.
Yeah, and it's strange how I feel like on a professional level, it's like we are striving toward eliminating that, but the ghosts still prevail. I think that I will title myself as both, but it's weird how it really depends on where you are and who you're talking to, how you have to present that.
So you shift depending on the conversation?
Yeah. But I will say right now, am I a contemporary artist? Yes. Am I a craftsperson? Yes.
Yeah.
Do those things need to be separate? Not at all.
No.
Yeah.
Why do you think they are? Or how do you think that came into being in the first place, and what's its purpose?
Yeah, the division of labor we were talking about, I think has a huge role. I think that it is really class division. It's class division because craft is often, its accessibility is what is used to discredit it. But I think that use is a uniquely human visual language. And I also think that, what is deemed to be contemporary art was often the domain of institutions and the bourgeoisie class, and so it was a way to remain fixated on an in-group, that craft was separated from that. And I think there's also some gendered history to that too as well. Craft was so often maintained and carried forward through generations and tradition by women, right? And in Western capitalist structures, the labor of women is far too often devalued, right?
Yeah.
So.
Yeah. And you mentioned, you used the word use in the course of answering the question, which to me is one of those things that has often been invoked to try and create a sort of a convincing idea that there is a division between the two. So the craft object is something that people often associate with something that's useful. A teapot, even if it's made by hand, becomes a useful object and therefore is distinct from a work of art, which may not have any use beyond being an aesthetically pleasurable thing.
Well, let me ask you this, like,
Yep.
is that not like a tactile symbol of privilege there?
Absolutely.
Like it takes a certain degree of privilege to spend your money and thus your labor on something that will not actually be used.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like-
And I think that is certainly something that has played into the creation of that division between the two. The division is one of those things that I don't think, my feeling is that it's more of a modern kind of convention. It came really from the 18th century onwards with the creation of a sort of connoisseur class of people who had a certain level of knowledge bestowed upon them, or they claimed that title for themselves through their education, and then were able to separate objects based upon whether or not they were aesthetically pleasing or whether they were useful objects. And I think it plays very much into the things you're talking about, division of labor, class distinctions, and so forth. But if you go back in history, it certainly isn't always the case. You can go to museums, for instance, with Renaissance art. We were talking a little bit about Renaissance art before, where you'll see plates that were used in dinner settings as a functional thing, but they were also treated as works of art, as much works of art as the paintings hanging on the wall.
Right.
So it strikes me as something that's very much more a modern kind of contrivance.
Well, I think that ties back into my qualms with like mass production and capitalism, because I feel like perhaps this division was also like capitalism's answer to commodify something that wasn't otherwise meant to be commodified, right? Because making is what makes us human. For better or for worse, for good or for bad, we make, we build.
Right.
Right?
Yep.
So how do you commodify that? How do you separate people from that?
Right.
How do you assign a numerical value on something that has existed since we have?
Right.
So
Right.
since time immemorial.
So given your thoughts on the relationship between fine art and craft and the problematic aspects of that, we're now at a point in history where we're starting to seriously, critically look at colonialism and the thinking behind it and how pervasive it still is. One of the things that always used to strike me as funny when I was in university myself was the idea of post-colonial studies and the fact that we would even use the term post-colonial when colonialism still exists. You know, it's still quite pervasive. So from your comments about your own work and the process and talking about the division of the problematics of dividing craft and fine art, how do you see it as something that is the division between the two as an extension or expression of colonialism also through the visual arts?
Oh, the division of craft and art?
Yes, yeah.
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
I would say that, like, you know, this idea of, like, think about how many colonial powers took from indigenous cultures what had spiritual and functional meaning to them, and then, like, exoticized that and put it into a context where it didn't belong for their own enjoyment.
Right, right.
Right, and even just the language they use to describe those works, like the word primitivism makes me want to gag. Like,
Yeah, well, it's a very loaded term,
it's a loaded
certainly.
term, yeah.
Yeah, but it's amazing to see how freely it was used even into the 1980s and beyond. So, yeah, well, I think it's very interesting that through your work we can see some of these connections. And hopefully when people are actually visiting the work in the gallery, they'll be able to look beyond just these sort of aesthetics on the surface, which are strikingly beautiful, I might add.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you.
they're lovely, lovely works, just from an aesthetic point of view. But we'll be able to see through the process and through the physical qualities of the work, some of these connections to the more philosophical, critical side of your
And I
outlook.
think in presenting these works, how I do, I'm trying to step outside of the assumed state of normal, because sometimes I feel like nostalgia and assumption are like the biggest barriers I've had to break through in presenting this work. Like this piece, for example, gives people nostalgia, like the tractor seat and all that.
Right.
But I think just by being there, they are a strange occupier of the space. And I think it is a weird time that we're living in, that why do we have some waters that we can swim in, we can fish in, we can live in, and we have some that we just have a cultural understanding of that water is dirty, that water is polluted. That is unique to our time. And is that not a lasting echo of colonialism in and of itself?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I certainly think so.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you mentioned the sort of comfortable, the comforting nostalgic aspects
Yeah.
of the work and how people receive that, because in a sense, I think there's from what you're saying, there's a disquieting aspect to the works as well. And I'm hopefully people will also receive that too when they're looking at the work, that there may be comfort in looking nostalgically at some of the objects that you found, but the way you're presenting them also should provoke thought about some things that are not necessarily so comfortable.
Yeah, and it's strange because it's like, let's welcome those feelings, but let's process them in a different way, because it's like, yes, if you see like a tractor seat and you think, oh, my grandfather had this tractor, or I remember seeing this as a child. At the end of the day, if you love that tractor, why is it in a marsh? Right? Like, let's really take a step back and look at that.
That's a very interesting way of looking at it.
Yeah.
Well, on that particular note, I think you've summed up things very beautifully. I'd like to thank everybody for joining us tonight. Please stay tuned to the Lumiere CB website and our social media platforms on Facebook and Instagram for details on more events coming up over the next 2 weeks. And thank you very much for joining us tonight. Thank you, Josephine.
Thank you, Greg.
Good night, everyone.